Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Welcome to part two of this special two-part economic series. Last week we looked back on 2013. This time, with our favorite economists, we look forward to 2014. We hope you'll stay with us.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded December 13th, 2013. On this week's program, Dr. John Connaughton of the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, Dr. Frank Hefner of the College of Charleston, Dr. John Silvia of Wells Fargo, and Dr. Doug Woodward of the University of South Carolina. Now, here's Chris Williams.
Welcome to our program. This is part two of our economic review of 2013, and now we're looking forward to 2014. Guys, welcome back to the program. Yes, we are.
Happy New Year.
Yes, we are. You know, we didn't even last week. We didn't even get to the Affordable Care Act, and that's hard to believe. And that was by design. So, what about the Affordable Care Act, John? We kind of ended with you, but I had to cut you off.
No, I think in our discussion, part of the story is going to be we don't know all the rules. The rules are constantly changing.
Will we know all the rules sometime in 2014?
No, probably take another 2 or 3 years to figure out what is the balance of premiums, deductibles, penalties, fines. It'll take another year or two to work out the entire system in terms of where we are. But following on our conversation, you have uncertainty in the short run. It leads people to do a little bit less of whatever it is they're going to do. They're more cautious in terms of hiring people on average.
And it really varies across, the different kinds of businesses. Large employers, this 2014 is the year, the employer mandate comes in, and that's over 50 employees. If you're a small business, you can actually get subsidies, and there will be an exchange for you. So I think there is a lot of uncertainty, but it isn't going to affect businesses evenly. It's going to be very uneven, just as it will be with.
Well, it's 900 pages long. That by now Congress should have read it, even though it's been passed. And so eventually they'll set up the regulatory mechanisms to actually enforce the law that they passed. And that's the big issue right now, is even though the broad general guidelines are in place, there are a lot of the details that are left to be decided. And it's kind of like, and we'll get to later, financial regulation. Mm-hmm. A lot of the details, the mechanism's there, but the details have not been decided yet.
I think the thing that people need to understand is this is the law of the land, and it's not going to change anytime soon. So throughout 2014, there's not going to be a change in that law to make it better or to repeal it. It's going to be implemented during this year as it's set forth.
But that was true in 2013, and then they changed it.
They pushed back some things. That's all they did. They didn't change anything. They just pushed things back.
Right, okay.
And so, that likely to happen this time. Again, there'll be some pushback in terms of some deadlines will be moved depending on how well the system's run, and as Frank said, how well they've designed the enforcement system for the rules that are in place. But we need to understand that nothing is going to change. This is going to be the law of the land. It will get tweaked maybe after the 2014 midterm elections, but it's not going to get changed between now and then, and it's going to roll out, and it's going to become a bigger and bigger footprint on the healthcare system in this country.
And hold on to that. By the way, that water is not a prop. You can use that if you'd like.
Okay.
It's actually pretty good. Well, let's go back to, to that point. Are we going to see more than anecdotal stories about sticker shock on premium increases?
It's absolutely going to happen, because it is going to be so uneven. Some people are going to benefit from these exchanges, and some people are not, I think just over time, with more competition, I think we're going to bend that cost cost curve on healthcare. It's already starting to happen and be some positive effects, but there's going to be individuals, and you're going to hear from them, who are not going to benefit from this at all.
Not only premiums, but also the deductibles. In
Right.
terms of
And you're going to see a lot of the projections, just by nature of the complexity of this legislation. There is no way anyone could have accurately forecasted the size of the budget that was involved, the number of people. I mean, it's predicated on a heroic set of assumptions that X number of people will sign up, so many of them will be of this particular health category and will pay this premium. And if they don't do that, then all of a sudden all bets are off on the cost issues on this. And so that's another thing. I mean, how's that cost going to be split? What's that going to do to our future budgets also? And those are all serious
And
unknowns.
then I just want to quickly say, it's
yeah.
going to play out differently in 50 different states.
Right.
Because some states are setting up exchanges, some are accepting Medicaid. Carolina's not. They're going to start subsidizing blue states for Medicaid payments. And Vermont is setting up a single-payer system.
And not just amongst the states. It's going to play out differently within the counties, within the states.
Right.
You get dramatic differences in the premiums, depending on whether you're in an urban county with a number of competitors offering on the exchange versus a rural county where you have one provider who's in a monopoly position. And the biggest mistake in this act, I think, without question, is the fact that they did not allow cross-state bidding on this. So that, and that's a historic problem because every state has an insurance commissioner, and they approve all the plans in those states. And even though the federal law now has the bronze plan, the silver plan, et cetera, which are standards by which every plan has to meet, it's still the responsibility of the state insurance commissioners to check the box.
So my forecast is this. This time next year, we will still be discussing how this is being implemented, even though it's currently the law of the land.
Okay,
And
so
it will not have changed.
So we have talked
And we'll still
about.
have job growth.
So we have talked. You guys probably don't even need me here for this dialogue, do you? So
We discussed that
I
earlier.
say that because I love y'all. So we've talked about all of this from the consumer's point of view. What happens to the hospitals? How do in the hospitals right now, we're in the black hats, just like the banks were wearing the black hats back in 2008. But what happens to the healthcare providers, because they are under pressure? And you can say what you want about the profitability of some of the hospitals, but we need them to be the hospitals. Correct?
The big change
Am I
for
right
the
about?
hospitals is the DISH funds are going away that support when somebody comes into emergency care and doesn't have health insurance, the hospitals do get compensated now from the federal government for that. That's going away. So we're not taking Medicaid in the Carolinas. It's really going to be a hard blow for these
The
hospitals.
second big thing, both for doctors and hospitals, is now there's going to be a grading system in place in terms of how well do you do. In other words, how many comebacks do you have? And that's going to affect their reimbursement rates. And so, the hospitals are amongst I wouldn't call them losers, but amongst that group that stands to lose quite a bit depending on how they respond to the incentives in the new healthcare act.
Well, the other one is going to be small businesses, because one of the
In what
points that
way?
was mentioned earlier, large businesses already have the regulatory mechanisms in place. They've already got somebody there who's doing this for them already, either with private insurance or however they're doing it. Small businesses may not have that, and so all of a sudden, they're going to be required to comply in some form or fashion, and they've never had to do that before. I mean, if I run a tire repair place, I don't have the expertise to do that. I'm going to have to hire John, and that's costly.
It's costly, but it also won't help you. But I think what Frank's talking about, just to simplify, it's the companies that are more than 50 employees who don't have an HR office at this point in time and haven't needed one. Well, they're now going to need one because this is going to be a little bit more complicated.
Right.
And so it's not just that they're going to have to provide health insurance for their 50 employees. They're going to have to add a separate arm, an operation that's going to cost them equally to the payments they make for health insurance, just to be sure that they're in compliance with things, or they're going to have to hire a consultant to come in and do that. But on the same token, that's new business opportunities for companies to start out providing that consulting opportunity.
Just what we need, more companies complying with regulation.
Well,
It creates jobs.
It creates jobs, but I don't know if it creates a good
Jobs, I
economy.
think. Well, it'd be interesting to see what helps with the healthcare job
Yes.
situation,
Well,
which has been a big part of the recovery. And you talked about that before, Frank.
before we get off on a comment you made, Doug, about the emergency rooms being kind of the first line of defense or the primary care for those that are least among us. So I want to ask you this question. As this good fortune in the economy has trickled down, if you will, to use that term, and in trickled down to the nonprofits and the human services providers, is it going to trickle down? Are these folks that have been facing, unbelievable odds that don't even make median income or close to the poverty level, what happens to these folks that have already been kind of buffeted and hit by the loss of nonprofit providers? And not just healthcare, but in general.
Well, I mean, all these people, depending on their income situation, are going to be eligible for some kind of health insurance. They're either going to be in some of the states that bought into the new Medicaid expansion. That's going to pull in a whole bunch of people. Some of the working poor will get pulled into the new Medicaid because it's 30% over the poverty level now, I think. Something like that to now be eligible for Medicaid. So those will be
150%.
I'm 150%. Yeah, I'm sorry. So it's 50% over, and they'll be brought into the Medicaid program now, and so they will have pretty good
Not
insurance.
in the Carolinas.
Not in the Carolinas. I'm just saying in other states. But even in the Carolinas, lower income people are going to be, once the website's up and working, are going to be eligible for big subsidies on buying health insurance policies through the exchange. The one problem, and Frank alluded to this earlier, the one problem with those exchange policies, while they got a lot of coverage, they do have big deductibles for things that aren't guaranteed to be provided free. So if you wind up in the hospital, okay, not going to an emergency room or something along those lines, you're going to have to pay out of your pocket in some way, shape, or form. And a lot of folks are going to, two things are going to happen. One is a lot of folks are going to be shocked by that.
Will they be turned away if they can't pay out of their pocket?
No, they won't be turned away, but the hospital will, a lot of Americans will learn that the new accounting practices of hospitals have been in place for quite some time for the more affluent uninsured in the
Okay,
country.
before we get too far in the weeds with this, John, I want to ask you this question. Doug, you just said again, you said something about, but not the Carolinas, right. In North Carolina, Governor McCrory says that we're not opposed to taking the Medicare dollars and the Medicaid dollars from the federal government. We want to fix our system. And the McCrory administration believes that if they fix the Medicaid system, then there's going to be many more dollars for the general operating budget in North Carolina. Do you think that the old North State will end up having a federal Medicare relationship? And do you think South Carolina will?
I don't
No way to
really able to judge that. I think, again, as I mentioned earlier, all of this will evolve over the next 2 to 3 years, and we'll see where things go. The 5 years. I mean, one of the problems I always have is, again, these implementations seems to be delayed. They're even revised. Things are going to change, and I like John's point earlier. To me, is like if the fines are so small that they're not going to get people to do the things that the federal government thought they were going to do, my suspicion is the fine's going to be increased. That something's going to happen along the way, that the federal government will change the rules as we go along when they're not getting the behavior they expected.
Can they do that, though, without Congress approval?
I don't think they can without
that's
Congress.
tough.
And we have to
Well,
remember.
I don't know. It could be an administrative issue rather than a legal issue. So, I mean, once you've got the mechanism set up and you empower the agency to do that.
Frank, I disagree with you.
Well, that's okay.
The Supreme Court specifically identified it as a tax.
Right.
And taxing power originates in one house by Constitution. And that's
That was clearly the debate.
And that's the House.
Whereas the Supreme Court has not successfully identified the minimum wage as a tax.
And thank you for that great segue, Dr. Hefner, because I know health insurance and health care takes up almost a third now of the federal budget.
Right.
We're not going to let it take up a third of our time on the program. So. Minimum wage, seriously, that was a point. Should we increase minimum wage?
Well,
or is this back to the same thing about, the market needs to
point about
decide?
whether it's, of course, as Doug will know, I'll always say I'm pro-market solutions on every one of these ideas. But the biggest thing that a lot of people...
means no.
Yes, which means no. But basically that what people forget is the minimum wage effectively is a tax. It's just a question of who pays for it. So if you wanted to help people out, one thing you could do is you could subsidize low-income workers. That's where the government actually provides the money. But they're still going to tax someone to give them the money. Or you can ask the employer to go ahead and do this, in which case you're taxing that particular employer. What'll happen is the research is almost clear. It's not like that one. It's almost clear that if you increase the minimum wage, you are going to reduce job creation among the worst group of people, the people that you really want to come into the labor force, get the labor training, get the skills of having a job, get used to performing in that environment, and then moving up. Because very, very few people actually start at the minimum wage and stay there.
I'm with the Pope on this.
Okay,
I believe in a
please.
just wage. I think it ought to keep up with inflation. And I don't think the evidence is so clear, unlike what a lot of economics textbooks say, that minimum wage is so punishing to the job market. I mean, it creates demand. We've got to deal with this distribution of income problem in this country, if not throughout the world. And that's what I mean by agree with the Pope.
Okay, I know this is going to be hard for you to do. Yes or no? Minimum wage. Yes
I
or
can't.
no?
I got a great story to tell you about minimum wage.
I knew it.
Okay, when I was a teenager, my boss came in and said, "John, I'm giving you a raise to $1.25 from $1.15 an hour." Lo and behold, I had no idea that the minimum wage
got
had
that
risen.
too, buddy.
Yeah, had risen from $1.15 to $1.25. But it made me think, and that is okay. This was back in the early '60s. Made me think. Well, what would $1.25 back in those days be today? Be over $9. So when we think about that, we've been sitting with this minimum wage over the years, and recently it has actually slipped back. Now, I'm with Frank on this. I'm a free market kind of guy, but the reality is, ingrained in our culture is a minimum wage. It hasn't been keeping pace with inflation. The $1.25 minimum wage in 1963 is now a $9.35 minimum wage today. And we're $2 behind that roughly. So I've got kind of mixed feelings on this. And Doug's right. The literature is really uncertain. Now, you can read studies that will suggest it has no effect. One thing we do know is it has little effect in the short run. The literature only suggests that in the long run it has some effect. And
Okay.
So that brings to mind
Wait a
another
minute.
issue.
No. Hold on to that. I'm not going to let you segue out of this one either. Or in addition, let's kind of zoom out. Let's talk about interest rates. Sure. Let's talk about the Fed has given indication that they are going to stop this quantitative easing to some as clear as the Fed can be. So where are interest rates going this year, John? What would you bet that they're going to do? And how is the Fed going to unwind the balance sheet of these billions of dollars in bonds that they put on there?
I would suggest that we split it in two parts. The short end of the yield curve stays pretty much where it is because that's based upon the federal funds rate.
So current interest prime rate's probably not going to go much higher.
Probably those rates stay pretty short. But the long end of the curve, even with the end of the so-called almost taper in September, long rates have actually stayed up and have risen recently. So I would say that the long end of the yield curve probably drifts up a little bit, which means that mortgage rates move up a little bit, maybe 25, 50 basis points. High grade, high yield bond, corporate bond rates move up a little bit. So the challenge for most CFOs, chief financial officers, is do I stay at the long end, the short end of the yield curve and roll over my debt at a very low interest rates and continue to do that thinking that those rates will not go up very much, or do I finance at the long end and perhaps in the short run pay more interest, but in the long run actually save money? And as we've seen with corporate treasurers in the last 3 years, I mean, they've issued an awful lot of high grade and high yield debt.
Because it's so cheap to lend money, or
It's
to get money.
perceived to be so cheap relative to what their long run cost would be.
So,
Well, I think I'm finally going to get it right after predicting that rates can only go one direction. And I think this is the year
It's
I might
like a
actually,
stop clock
yeah,
is right twice a
I might
day.
get it right that they're actually going to go up because of this reason.
Because the economy's improving.
And
too,
the
Fed
economy's
has said with
improving, right.
6.5%
Sure.
unemployment rate, we're getting close to that now with 7%. I think we're going to get there, and even the most dovish of the Fed governors are going to say, we need to unwind the quantitative easing. 2014 is going to be the year we're going to start to see that happen, and interest rates are going to go up. I agree with John, probably over 5% on the 30-year mortgage, and you don't think so, John, but 3% on the 10-year Treasury. So it's
it used
towards
to
the end
be
of the year.
it used to
That's
be in
also
the old
low
days.
interest rates, by the way. I want
Right.
to say.
It used to be in the old days that, a long time ago when we had better rules of thumb that actually worked for some reason, that when interest rates went up, that was a positive sign because business was doing activity.
right.
And so I think that's the kind of interest rate shift we'd like to see.
John, let me ask
John's assessment, I think, is pretty good in terms of laying out exactly the difference in what rates are going up, what rates remain unchanged. But the one wild card here is we're going to have a new Fed president or chairman in about a week and a half.
Right. Vice chair, too.
And she is very, very pro-quantitative easing, more so even than Bernanke has been. So while the Fed may taper, I'm not sure it's going to taper as much as we suspect it would have under Bernanke.
I agree.
They don't have to.
Yes, they will not taper as much as under.
Isn't that a bit like an alcoholic owning a bar? Isn't this a little bit dangerous?
I'll just reinforce, I think, John's point, where he's going is, remember also our federal deficit is shrinking.
Well,
So for the Fed to do
okay.
the same amount, they'd be eating up an awful lot of the new issuance in treasuries.
And I'm sorry, and I don't want to interrupt you, but if we have so much in federal debt and rates go up, isn't this a concerning issue? Doesn't this cause a
Absolutely.
problem?
On average, federal debt, 17 point X trillion of federal debt, rolls over on average about every 6 years. So we aren't really going to feel the kick in the pants as rates rise, and they are going to rise over the next several years. I think they're going to rise moderately this year, very little. I don't know that we'll see a 5% 30-year mortgage rate by the end of the year, but
That's still that's still a low interest rate.
Right.
Same with the federal debt, even if it goes up. I'm not saying it.
But as the
it's
Fed
gonna-
now starts to have to reissue longer maturity bonds at these higher rates, the debt service for that 17 trillion is going to become a problem over the next 6 years.
Let me just
And I
say
would
something
say-
real quickly about that, though, about that debt service. I always like to get this in here. Having the Federal Reserve own more of our debt, which is what quantitative easing does, means that they don't pay debt service except for their costs. They return it back to the Treasury. So we're actually going to benefit from some of the quantitative easing having the Federal Reserve own it.
And I would just make one last point, Chris, for the people who are investors. The challenge, I think, will be as interest rates rise, what they perceive as very short-term safe government bond funds and ETFs, they're going to see those rates rise and the net asset values go down. So there is a significant implication, even to a modest increase in interest rates, on the total return for a lot of investors when they're looking at what they thought was a very safe Treasury portfolio.
Not to
And-
mention,
and-
we had a 30% rise in the equity markets in 2013. How much higher does that go? Is there still a lot of oomph under earnings power? I mean, those are all good questions, John.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the
I think we're
Carolina-
all in agreement. Rates are going to rise. Long rates are going to rise. It's just a question as to how much this year.
And in the Carolinas, with our job growth, I don't think that this will stifle the housing market.
No, it's coming
because
back.
because what everyone has to realize is that no one ever bought a house because no unemployed person bought a house because mortgage rates were low. So basically, you need the job, and we're going to continue to see that.
We have 2 minutes left, and I want to get a couple things that are state-specific. In South Carolina, there's been a huge debate about the cost of repairing roads and bridges and infrastructure, and one of the items put out there and recently agreed upon was this $500 million in bond money that is going to be deployed now to building and rather repairing some of these roads and bridges. But what about the gas tax?
It has to go up. That's another.
I know it has to go up,
Yeah.
but Governor Haley's been against it, but the State House is for it. So what will happen? What's your prediction?
I'm not going to do the politics on that, but we desperately need infrastructure improvement because we can't have the amount of increased industry that we're having on the roads that we have right now. It's just not going to work. It has to be done.
We have been underfunding infrastructure in both states for 3 decades now. Cars get better gas mileage because the tax is collected on a per gallon basis. Even if the tax rate on that were to go up because people are using fewer gallons because mileage is going up, their burden is not going to change that significantly.
And oil prices are dropping.
And
So
oil prices.
when does that come to roost? When's the tipping point on the infrastructure, on the
I believe we're-
collapses.
Yeah, like in Minneapolis, but I think we're already there in terms of what's going on in the infrastructure. We simply do not have an infrastructure in this state, North Carolina, consistent with the economy here.
Isn't infrastructure a proxy for economic development? I mean, isn't this the bones of what happens in communities?
Well, it goes both ways. Better
And education.
infrastructure allows better transportation, and the better transportation allows the economy to continue to improve. So it works both ways.
Everybody gets it too. They understand. Nobody denies that infrastructure isn't critical. It's one of those things. It's just like education. I mean, those are the two things. that
Those are the
matter.
two hot buttons. Will those continue to be the two
Question's
hot
how to
buttons going
fund them,
forward?
so yes.
Education?
Yeah.
They will continue to be the hot button.
But the problem is that you've got a body of politicians that are just scared, absolutely scared of a tax increase of any kind anywhere.
Yeah,
Well, so let's translate that. What they're really afraid of is smarter, well-traveled people.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, we're out of time. I wish we didn't even talk about the politics and getting along better. Do you think you think we will get along better?
Oh, I
Well,
think
I've always liked
it's
you.
already happening.
Yes, no.
Yes.
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 Oh, my gosh.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Guys, thanks for being on the program once again. Happy holidays to you. I hope we're sitting here next year smiling just as easily saying, yeah, we were kind of close, but we were wrong about the bad things and right about the good things. Good to see you all.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you. Happy
be
New
here.
Year, happy holidays. And
Happy
thank you for
holidays to
watching our
everyone.
program. Going forward in this new year, we certainly hope that your business, your health, your family are good. And then thank you for watching and supporting this program for the last quarter of a century or so. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.com.